Hello, everyone. Welcome to another ecosystem session. It's a return of Sacred Capital today, and we have Sid, Pospi, and Michael, and we'll learn more about the cast of characters in a moment, and we'll focus a little bit more, go a bit deeper into reputation, so into what Sacred Capital are doing around reputation language and the reputation vault. Have a bit of a demo and see where we end up exploring. Before we jump into that, I think I'll start. Sid, do you want to give us a little bit of a intro again, a reminder of yourself? Pospi, people will also know you from your amazing ecosystem session that blew a series of people's minds. A tiny bit of intro and how you're working with Sid, and then Michael, yeah, that's the same for you.
Sounds good. Awesome. Oh, should I go? So, hi, I'm Sid, and yeah, as most of you know, I'm the founder of Sacred Capital, and I'm very motivated by what economics of the future or distributed economics looks like, because economics, particularly in distributed environments, doesn't have the benefit of overarching consensus and legal mechanisms, and which is why reputation plays a really important role, because reputation helps us meet and engage and discover people in these distributed environments. And so the aspiration here is to build what's known as a reputation economy. And so almost activating reputation currencies to orchestrate new kinds of organizing. And in the long run, monetary currencies and marketplaces and bazaars flow as a result of reputation. So, yeah. As you'll see today, we'll talk a little bit about the reputation language and the reputation vault that both Pospi and Michael have been helping develop, which has been a lot of fun and mind bending. But I'll let them share a little more. Do you want to go, Pospi?
All right, I'll buy it. So hi, I'm Pospi. You've all heard me talk about REA stuff and accounting things on one of these calls before. Yeah, my interest in this work, I guess I could talk about a few things with that, but maybe the short version at the moment is that I got involved with what Sid was doing because once you acknowledge that a world can and will, and I suppose to some extent already does exist, where everybody is kind of digitally masters of their own destiny and hold on to their own information, then one of the first things you need is what folks are starting to think of as little data, but frameworks for you to kind of make use of all that information that you have as someone who's not a big central party in the network, but somewhere on the edges. And so, yeah, that's kind of my lens for all this reputation stuff, is through the lens of analytics and how you make use of large amounts of information into small actionable bits of information that actually mean something to you. So that's my interest here.
Cool.
I'm Michael. I'm the newest addition, I guess, both to the team and to Holochain. My background is more in kind of language theory, like more the part of, and I used to do blockchain style nerdy language sometimes, and so this avenue in here is in economics and distributed economics. And so, yeah, I've been helping out with the reputation DSL or domains, and yeah, that's a
Cut out a little bit there, Michael. Maybe you could give us the intro again, if possible.
Oh,
yeah.
The whole, okay.
Yeah, the whole
Sorry.
thing.
Do you want to try switching off
Okay.
video?
Yeah, maybe I'll try that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that any steadier?
Yeah. So far.
Okay. All right. We'll try again. Sorry about that. Yeah. So I guess I'm the newest addition both to the team and to Holochain as a space. My background is more in kind of programming language theory and the academic researchy side of computer science. Yeah, and then also I did a stint in blockchain land before getting a bit disillusioned with that. And so my kind of angle of interest is both the distributed economics and the building of languages and kind of how the linguistic angle to articulating culture and articulating computation, I guess. So yeah, that's about it.
Super, I can see the fit. Yeah, especially language that enables the movement of whatever between agents and reputation, I guess, being one of the things that then supports the way that the communication moves or how the communication works, etc. Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, you were saying something.
No, well, I was just wondering, I wonder for a moment if we could kind of be a fly on the wall of one of the more like, I'm not sure what kind of debates you guys have or discussions you guys have when you're working through or either what you're designing or what you're building, but I think it could be pretty fascinating for people to just to drop into one of those discussions for 15 or 20 minutes and just get a sense of the kind of things that you're working through. So pick maybe a big question on your mind right now that you're working through with reputation.
There has been some fairly major design decisions and tech choices made lately that Michael's been kind of working through, weeding out possibilities. But there is also kind of a bigger conversation about the origins of language and how language impacts behavior and all these things, which is kind of one of the bigger rabbit holes that we like to go down.
Yeah,
feel
there
free to
was.
jump. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess we could talk about this language choice thing. Is my audio still good? Just checking.
Yeah, it's great. It's great.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so we started building this little custom domain-specific language. I kind of hacked this thing up. It's basically building an interpreter for a Lispy-like language in Rust. And yeah, I guess the idea there is controlling the whole language would allow us to kind of do whatever we like with supporting different types of expression or allowing users to articulate culture or metrics or computations just how we like. And then since I have this strong interest and background in Haskell, and it's kind of my favorite language, although Rust is pretty cool too, but I did this, it occurred to me that we could try to repurpose an existing language, something like Haskell, as the DSL instead of building our own. And then we get the benefit of lots of existing libraries and tools in that ecosystem. So I guess, yeah, one of the discussions we had was around how what this trade-off is between controlling and shaping the experience of like using the DSL by building it ourselves, which then requires a lot of work to build it, or trying to use something that already exists, but getting having less of a custom fit there.
I can give some context. I think when we jump into conversations about reputation, there is this constant tendency to think about reputation with the same lens that we think about money. And you see so many projects mashing reputation in the blockchain, and what you see immediately is like this, like the same way that you think about cryptocurrencies, you tend to transfer to the way you think about reputation. And so, if someone's issuing badges or certificates, like you tend to think of them as coins or like gold that you can hoard. And more importantly, you tend to see this, like the moment you hear about reputation, you tend to think of like this universalist monoculture that should be applied to groups of people. So, for example, um, if you speak to someone who's building a social network or a social media platform, when you speak to them about reputation, they invariably migrate towards, oh yeah, cool, like how can we create a this reputation currency that'll make everyone on our platform, I don't know, more kinder to each other, or less violent towards each other, or more generous towards each other. And instead, what we've realized through our conversations over the last, how many ever months, is reputation is best articulated locally. And so reputation is always like culture, like best done when you're doing it in a particular context. And so our big challenge was, as more and more conversations are moving to the virtual space, instead of creating reputation systems for massive platforms or massive institutions, instead letting groups of people, like they may vary from a few thousands to a few million, but all of these groups of people in these social networks to articulate culture for their group. Like maybe it's a group of people that are sharing funny memes. Maybe it's a group of people that are sharing insightful research. Maybe it's a group of people who are involved in some kind of wellness activity. And so to articulate this language locally, we've been developing what's known as a reputation language, because you want to allow people to speak to each other and articulate this culture in a very, very easy way. And so some of what Pospi and Michael were talking about is part of that discussion of what should that language be like. How do we go about building it? And what's most important is it should be easy to iterate, easy to for groups of people to to actually articulate it in an easy way. Almost in my mind, as the entrepreneur, I'm thinking it should be as easy as entering a formula into an Excel spreadsheet, so you can actually keep tweaking it. Like maybe in our community of that's sharing memes with each other, we value likes and we don't want upvotes and downvotes, and this is how we value whose memes get shown the most in our community, and here's the formula for it. And maybe it didn't work, and so then we re-articulate it. And so that's the role of this language. And I can show, I guess Michael can take us through a demo of some of that. But basically it's allowing communities to create their own sense making frameworks, as opposed to depending on Facebook's algorithms that drive, or central platforms algorithms to drive engagement within their groups. And so that's what the language is part of. And so a lot of conversations around how we go about doing this. And there's a few more nuances to this, because when you're allowing groups of people to articulate culture, obviously what you also want is for what they're valuing to be interpreted and understood across groups. And so that's where the way we create types, the way we allow articulations in one community to be understood by another, like maybe likes in Pospi's community also make sense in David's community, and how do you allow for that kind of transference and understanding across membranes? Like that's also part of it. I can feel Pospi itching to go with some thoughts. Am I right? But I'll
Sure.
stop there.
Sure. I think the other interesting thing to reflect on here is when we started thinking about, these ways that you might express culture in a digital space, and some of these things that Sid is talking about, like the way that you order a news feed, that's kind of the question of what becomes visible to people, and the way that you distribute benefits within a collective based on the ways that people have behaved and contributed. Like, these are all types of reputation to us, and they're types of reputation that are largely algorithms that determine how these things get computed. So then the question becomes, if you want to create what Sid has often referred to as a formal economic language for culture, you'd better make sure that you're trying to leave as much room for expressivity as possible. You don't want to be narrowing things in any way with the worldview that you have. You want people to be as free as they can possibly be to say what culture means to them. And we figure, and it's still the best solution that we have, and probably the best one that we're likely to have, that the most non-prescriptive thing that you can possibly offer people is a Turing complete programming language, as in something that you can use to make any calculation that arrives at any answer based on some input data. It's kind of interesting that that would be not a possibility in another distributed environment, but because Holochain runs all the computation locally to yourself, you can do infinite recursion and stuff, and not worry about overloading a network so much. So those problems of Web3 are kind of past us in Holochain, which is nice. But the other thing that's really interesting about all this is going to be the journey of where we even go with it. Like, we're kind of starting first steps on a road that we really don't know where the destination is yet. And what Michael was talking about with trying to decide between whether we use an existing language like Haskell, which has a very robust community of mathematicians and statisticians and things behind it, or create something ourselves. Either way, whichever choice we made, we would still be in a position, like Michael was talking about, we can make a calculation any way that we like. And so my question in that sentence is, who is we in that sentence? And at the moment, it's what we like, as people that are kind of computer sciencey and kind of analysts. But there's also a particular worldview involved in how analysts think, and the ways that we analyze data and make conclusions. And that's a good place to start, because that's where we have all of those tools in society today. But we want to be evolving this language over time in a direction that we're not providing that same sort of kind of Excel spreadsheety Google Sheets kind of way of calculating stuff. We want to be getting towards a more human language. And the other big thing that's come up through all this, that Michael's had a lot of conversations with Fellow from the Basin Project about, is the idea that the if construct in computers is a very exclusionary and kind of hard-edged, logical construct. So then it's a question about, well, we might want to provide less of those kinds of logics in our language, and more kinds of probabilistic logics that are more loose and fluid and can give fuzzy answers that allow a gentler kind of inference in people. So those are just some examples of the kinds of questions that we're trying to hold space for in this work when we're thinking about the design of such a language and who might wield it down the track. So there's a lot of layers to kind of pull apart.
With all of that in your minds, how do you go about just taking a step?
All of this while working with variations in Holochain's architecture as well, right? And so it feels like a multi-dimensional puzzle that we're trying to piece together. But I've really appreciated some of the conversations we've had with Eric Harris Brown. I think he frames it as the adjacent possible, and I've I've been mulling over that phrase, like sitting over this on it for the last few months. And I think there's a certain quality of like tempering what you want to do and what you want to see in the world with where you're at. And so part of this tension is constantly, what are the moving pieces, which moving pieces are there for you to work with right now, and make some calculated risks to keep moving. And I absolutely agree. I think sometimes when there's too many moving pieces, there can be this analysis paralysis of sorts. And so, yeah, we've been kind of weaving together the path forward for some of this stuff. And so, building out some of the bits of the language, trying to piece together what the early use cases will be, and therefore which kinds of entrepreneurs we want to be speaking to. And that, surprisingly, that's taken us a while. Um, but I feel like we're finally there now. And, this is the group of entrepreneurs we want to be speaking with initially. And they're largely people who are creating some kind of community based platforms where, groups like similar to Facebook groups or hilo groups, groups of people who are having conversations among themselves, or some kind of offline activity among themselves, are trying to use reputation to make sense of each other and engage with each other. And so, yeah, there's a bunch of there's a few ideas we have about what kind of use cases would emerge first, and then how we push that, and we frame the next step as the adjacent to the adjacent possible, and the next step as the adjacent to the adjacent to the adjacent possible. But I think it's been fun, or at least the entrepreneur in me likes like taking those calculated bets. um, and I think that's part of the fun of it. Like, if you want to do something revolutionary, at some point you're going to have to take some of those bets. Sometimes they blow up in your face, but I guess that's part of it. um, yeah.
I totally hear an opening for a demo in here somewhere. I'm wondering if maybe Michael can show us through some of those first steps.
I'm wondering if the demo might break people though right now. In the sense, I I don't know if maybe I should share a few slides, because I think there might be a few people. Oh, sorry, have I shared it already? Um, yeah, I don't know, David. What do you think?
Yeah, well, you're both picking up a desire for something visual. Yeah, let's go for the slides, then conversation, then demo. I think that's probably the flow that you might had in mind that might spark.
Yeah, because I think the demo is, I think lines of code up front might, like I said, break people.
Yeah, I think that's wise.
Yeah, I mean, some of this, the first couple slides, obviously people might have seen from the last video, but reputation infrastructure that we're building just helps people discover, meet, and engage in these distributed environments. And in my head, this is a question that really needs solving, because centralized tech has the benefit of these aggregated dashboards at their end, which allows them to drive algos, which drive our engagements. And so when I sign up on Twitter, I'm shown like a bunch of posts that I'm probably going to be interested in based on my past history. Um, but in distributed environments, you don't have that centralized data dashboard, right? Like, entrepreneurs or app creators won't even really know where data exists or whether it exists or not. And so I think like social intelligence or sense making, local sense making frameworks need to emerge to allow people to make sense of what they're doing in distributed environments. And I honestly think that's exciting, because all, like, life isn't our lives aren't governed by a central algo. They're governed by little calculated risks we take on one another. And so I think reputation infrastructure is about that. And so what is reputation infrastructure? Like we said, it's a language, reputation language, which is, as the visual suggests, like a group of people speaking in reputation data, which basically means, like, this is what this is how they validate things, either with likes or upvotes or tracking timestamps or tracking how many miles you've run every weekend or how many hours of work you've contributed to the local local farm. And then the reputation vault allows an individual to hold that information in a sovereign manner and port it as they move from one community to another. And so the reputation language really is about community-based sense making, which basically again means computations are done locally. And so if we're a group of people that are sharing memes, if we issue a trophy to someone or a star rating to someone, or if we, simply use the number of likes to figure out whose memes get posted above the other, um, all of that is really locally held. So my rank in this community is only limited to this community. Like it shouldn't be, the stars that I've earned in one community can't really be ported over to another. Like the computation is local is the point. And so what you're starting to see is, instead of these generic social media platforms where a central algo is shoving content down people's eyeballs, and it doesn't matter if it's cat videos or deep intellectual research, all that matters is that it's sensationalist and you're glued to your phone. Instead of that paradigm, you're moving to this almost these I think we'll move towards social media platforms where you're enabling groups of people. They may be 500 or 10,000 people, or maybe even 1 million people, to converse with each other and interact with each other, but their reputation system drives sense making and interactions. Um, and so the reputation language that Michael will do a demo on is allowing those groups of people to do it locally and in a flexible way so they can keep iterating. And so maybe likes aren't working, maybe we need to move towards upvotes, maybe our formula isn't quite right, and so we need to tweak it. Pospi is really excited about one community liking what another community does and actually just copying or creating or just replicating someone else's formula. And so I think the reputation language facilitates that. It allows for these computations on the fly. And so all of this obviously can be validated through Holochain. And so when if you have a high rank status in one community, it isn't fudged because it's done through the Holochain network. It's validated through the membrane and Holochain. And so an important part of this language is also type inference, and so ensuring there's some amount of coherence across apps. And so likes that I use maybe in Junto or Hilo or some kind of Facebook group is actually understood by another community as well. So the likes that I might have received in one community aren't restricted to that community, but they can be ported. And that's where the reputation vault comes in, because it allows that kind of porting. And yeah, maybe real quick, I'll talk about some of the use cases, but think about social media that as we currently experience it, except engagement is driven through communities themselves articulating what is important to them, as opposed to a central algo driving engagement. And you might also see town squares where you'll have meeting places where technically you can see you can see spillover of cultures as well. You can see mashing of cultures as well. And so if someone's really popular in the permaculture community, maybe you also think of them as good people you'd like to host for couch surfing or Airbnb as Airbnb guests, or maybe someone you've been closely affiliated with in some of your groups on social media might be people you'd like to meet in person. And so town squares would be places where people can start mashing culture and start meeting with each other. And then you have standalone apps where you might have, it's not just conversations on social media, but it's groups dedicated to wellness or gaming or permaculture or food related systems or micro credentialing. I think that list goes on for quite a bit. But yeah, these are some of the use cases that are emerging. Pospi, is there anything you'd like to add to some of this?
nothing heaps coming up at the moment. I guess it's really just interesting to me thinking about giving people control over algorithms and all the ways that that can be useful and emancipatory in different contexts. I mean, the news feed kind of stuff is obvious low hanging fruit, but the other big set of use cases that Sid's not really outlining here, a lot of groups doing things in natural capital accounting and impact assessment, particularly when it comes to carbon impact assessment. There's a lot of big institutional standards like that, and at the moment, all those systems are kind of coded by software people in big companies. But I think there's an avenue there that we can start to bring some of those certifications down into spaces where people understand them better and people have agency to go and improve them and make them better.
Yeah, and so I think some of these use cases are emerging, and it's been fascinating having conversations with people. Some of them, like this is one that's outlined here. Someone's trying to build an entrepreneur platform for entrepreneurs where there's information that's drawn and that's publicly available data, as well as information from other kinds of circles. So it might be distributed workforces, it might be freelance networks for designers and devs, and reputation data plugs in, and then groups of people figure out who's a good entrepreneur, who's worthy of meeting or working with individually and for that community. But yeah, all of this, I guess, fits into some of our long-term shifts that we, I think, spoke about last time, moving from businesses to what are neighborhoods, where specific cultures articulated by those communities allows for more commercial engagements and capital and content to flow within those communities, as opposed to a current paradigm of very generic culture and trying to do business with people or engage with people without specifically articulated culture. And so I think, yeah, one of our longer term aspirations is moving from markets to bazaars, but maybe that's another conversation. I'm wondering, I think it might be, instead of focusing on the bazaars, but maybe dialing it back to the reputation language.
Yeah,
And
Sid,
maybe
exactly. Could you go to your first screen? I just want to see if I can make sense of something. Yeah,
this bit?
perfect. Actually, the one before that. So the language and the vault. Okay, so in the context of reputation, I just want to test that I'm clear on something. So effectively, you're building an underlying pattern that allows, just like we talk about currencies being the seeing of currents, and so by building patterns that allow people to build currencies on Holochain, what you're supporting people to do is make a choice of the currents to make visible. With our reputation language, we're making a choice on the things people do or how people are, what to make visible in that. Now, we're like, you're building the possibilities for people to make those choices. And in making those choices, okay, I want to make this visible, then supporting the conversation within and between communities.
Yes, that is pretty well articulated. I might take a snippet of that recording. Yeah. But you're exactly right. And I think one of the pieces of friction that we noticed was for people to articulate these currencies was actually, having to write chunks of code just to articulate what that currency is. And where most often, I think communities, if you're just groups of thousands of people, you're not actually going to create an app for yourself. And you might also realize, hey, maybe we started off with likes, but after a couple of weeks we realize maybe upvotes and downvotes are more relevant for us. And so the reputation language kind of lets you play with that and iterate and tweak and make computations on the fly as you go. And so I think that's really critical in getting culture down to like smaller and smaller and smaller groups. And that second bit that you articulated really well was inference across groups. So let's say, I really think this community that's doing, having really great scientific conversations is someone, a group that I hold in high regard, and I would validate and I would hold in regard anyone who's rated highly by them. Maybe I like I want to respect the likes that they use. And so if someone with 50,000 likes from that community comes into my community, I would like to validate them as soon as they get here. And so the reputation language also allows for that basic type inference. And that's something Michael could speak about a little more, across communities. And I think that's really important, because if we don't do this, you see that same slide towards the large, like the large communities end up dominating because only their reputation is valid. It's like today, what differentiates an
And
Uber
it's
from a local cooperative isn't the tech, but because their reputation is valid across so many people's. Go ahead, Pospi.
that reputation is the way it is because it requires a tech team in order to design it at this point in history, right? Like you need to be Uber creating Uber in order to create that reputation system.
Yep.
You need that kind of budget. So there's maybe some other interesting reflection here. Like it's come up for a few times talking about this stuff where people start saying, are you building Scepter, or like, what's the overlap here? Yeah, it's interesting hearing you put it so eloquently that way, David, because I often find the currency language not so useful with all this stuff. But you're absolutely right. Like it is about you're creating some expression to be able to see a current that is already happening. When you think about the kinds of currencies that we use today, they all have this same property that they abstract and hide a bunch of stuff. Like the dollar figure on something hides a bunch of levies and all kinds of weird perverse market things that happen. So there's something quite profound in being able to turn this stuff that ordinarily in today's society is a product that it takes a team and a lot of money and a lot of work to be able to generate it. But we're trying to take these things that happen at, like in technical terms, it happens at compile time, and that's where things that technical people can do happen. But then there's once the thing is compiled and running, and it's an app that other people are using, then it can do all these other things at runtime. And so our effort to move the algorithm into runtime so that people can control it, A, it means they can iterate the algorithm and experiment more. But B, it means it gets us closer to this world in which everything is a protocol and no longer a product. It no longer takes this like big expenditure of energy to generate it and put it out there. You can just say it and it happens. So that's really exciting to me.
Yep. Yeah, I can. I can see the risk of overlap with Scepter, but being here, it doesn't feel like there's any overlap whatsoever in a way, because so I guess one of the images comes up, and I'm really which I would butcher the example, but it's like the McGreeby traders. So effectively they're solving a structural problem, which is how do you guarantee when you've got I'll think 1,000 years ago, when you've got sea trade, how do you guarantee what is going to happen at the dock of a country, far away, without any of the protocols we have today in place? And so there's a series of expressions of currencies on the ship, but there's also requirement of the ability to understand what will happen, who will be interacting with this, how will they be interacting, how will I say, etc. So there's this meta language about framing the entire, in this case, say the entire exchange, which is a really risky endeavor. I mean, I'm packing a ship and and a series of people to sail at a very risky time, at the hope that my goodwill in making that endeavor will be reciprocated by both, whatever is coming back to me. So it's a really risky scenario. And so, yes, while we have the currencies that are changing hand in that exchange, we need another meta language to frame this to ensure that the not just the transaction, but the overall interaction is safe, has an appropriate risk, and all sorts of things. And what I'm seeing is that sacred capital, that's the direction you guys are focused on. Like the reputation language paves the way for all sorts of these kind of interactions, exchanges. But it's this meta pattern that allows for the balancing exchange, the moving into the unknown, and especially as we're moving from centralized to distributed, that in that world, the structural change of that world will require entirely new conversations to happen in order to make basic agreements, that we would find today basic in a centralized world. And so by putting this language out there, it gives supports us to give us the tooling to be able to make those agreements, because without it, we'll find that we're blind.
I would add that in the past, groups of people or societies have also had meta languages, maybe not meta languages, some kinds of languages to organize themselves, but they've had to rely on like very tribal social fabric or patriarchal systems to affect it, right? Like, and so, which is why, especially in South Asia, the Middle East, you see these kinds of commercial engagements occurring at scale, but they're all affected through these networks of trust. But those networks of trust rely on what you could say, outdated modes of measuring and maintaining that fabric. And so I think you're right. I think this does allow us to move towards some of those new structures. Um, yeah. In fact, I think the word meta language itself is such a good phrase to use.
Michael, you've been very quiet.
Yeah, just kind of let it something sinking in. But yeah, I think one thing that came up when Pospi was speaking about this shift from compile to runtime, I thought was maybe worth expanding. Like part of the idea with the DSL, at least to me, is that we can express reputation computations and actually have them live in the DHT, just like any other Holochain data. And so instead of like devs or people with computers that can compile apps and deploy them being the only people allowed to kind of shape the rules of the game, you can have anyone who can write an expression and stick it in a DHT can now change what is computed. And so that's, yeah, kind of this opening up of access to more people, and also allows for kind of flexible remixing. So say Sid makes a computation that describes whether people are late, or gives them like a score for tardiness. But in my community, it's like more casual. I don't know, people show up like 10 minutes late and whatever, it's not a big deal. So I could, instead of, I could borrow Sid's code and tweak it, or I could even feed his output into my new computation that reweights things and kind of relaxes it a little bit. So there's possible, it allows for this kind of creative remixing of metrics, which seems pretty interesting.
one of the things that I'm excited about in the long run is for these kinds of computations to also go cross-membrane. And I think the language will help us build like the shared foundation of sorts where, let's say Pospi comes along and wants to, I don't know, Pospi wants to create a, some kind of score for tardiness, but sees that Sid and Michael have their own uh, tardiness score. Pospi could actually create their own tardiness score using timestamps from their community, but also timestamps from Sid and Michael's community. And I think that's when you really break that barrier of, oh, communities irrespective of scale, like contributions in communities are valid now across membranes, even if it's a really small one. And so I think the extrapolation of that is we don't need to be an Uber to ensure the safety of our passengers or drivers. You could have like these literally micro fragmented circles of car sharing networks, and reputation flows across the membranes without one big guarantor of safety um, being there centrally. So technically, if David wants to start his own car sharing network, he can pull in safety data across thousands of car sharing networks in his in and around him. And so people can use your car sharing network even without necessarily you being very large, and that starts throwing up some very interesting possibilities. And I think this is really also important because every time we start speaking about articulating culture and communities, like I think we have to be careful about how we aren't triggering some kind of massively tribal behavior where it starts becoming this us versus them dynamic, and instead, because of these bridges that exist between communities, there's almost like these collaborative feedback loops between them. But yeah, I think that's where the vault comes in, and that's another larger conversation that starts becoming possible once we build the foundations with this language.
The collaborative feedback loops get very interesting because we find we can do things like detect where the same logic is, even in subcomponents between different calculations, and figure out where people are using different language to describe the same things. So there's lots of neat ways that we can leverage Holochain to try and find commonality to help marry up language like that.
Great. Well, is this a good time for a demo?
Yeah, I think you could jump into it. Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, that sounds good. Would you be able to pull it up, Sid, the video?
Can do that. Just give me a sec.
Thanks. I'm somewhat technologically limited at the moment.
I do think, Michael, you're gonna have to really explain what's going on here.
Yeah, definitely.
Is this the right one? Do you?
Yeah,
the
that's
right
it.
One?
Yeah, you could probably hit the
Okay.
full screen button just to make it bigger.
Yeah. Do you want to lay the ground first?
Yeah. So this will show what's known as a REPL, a read eval print loop, which is basically a thing that lets you type in expressions and it'll evaluate them to values. It's kind of a programming language tool that lets you tinker around with the language. So here, this is showing the language I made and how it can evaluate expressions basically. So I think, if you want to run it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Give me a sec. Yep. There
If
we
you
go.
just hit, okay, cool. Yeah, so here we see it'll parse so the number 1 is an integer. It tells us it's an integer that the notation with the semicolon, the colon is so the value and then the type of the value. So we see there are different language features, like you can bind x to the value 1 and then refer to x. That's the first thing occurring. You can have lambda functions which take arguments and then use them in some way. And things like if to check equality of values. Yeah, so this is semi-standard programming language stuff. Just a demo showing basically it's a little language you can use to compute. And I think one thing worth pointing out perhaps is the types. We had mentioned before the idea of types as things that can be used across membranes or across communities to kind of orient around the same, speak the same language, I guess. And so here we have just simple types like integer, but you could imagine having something like a like type or a clap type, and then computations over those types. So what that would allow is if different communities used the same language and the same types, they could share some of this reputational infrastructure. So as we mentioned before, like maybe you don't have to build your own likes module. You can just use the one that you find somewhere in the DHT or in the language itself, perhaps. And you can, yeah, have a handle on what that type is.
Mm. And so to map it onto the language, the likes as a currency that's being used by one community could be technically understood by another community. Or maybe even that community doesn't like likes as a currency and wants to switch to upvotes and downvotes. So maybe claps, like doing it through the language just allows for that rapid iteration and local computation really well.
Yeah, and it makes
some
very
things maybe to
explicit.
point out.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Pospi.
sorry. There's also some things maybe to point out here around type inference and the type of language that Michael's built here. So it's not just about these equivalences, but also being able to understand, go and divide it and figure out how many likes in a day, then the system should be able to figure out and tell you that the resulting type that you've defined is now likes per day kind of thing. So those kind of computations can be handled. And the other one that's something that we're hoping to be able to do, which there's logic out there for it. It's just a case of sticking it all together. But having a language that's intelligent enough to know that I can go and add 5 kilometers to 3 miles, and it'll come out with an answer and know that they're both length units. So yeah, there's some additional smarts that we're planning on adding to the type system in order to be able to deal with real world units more, but also to make sure the language is not difficult to use and that it's smart enough to prompt the user and let them know what they're doing wrong.
Yeah, thanks. And I think on the, in the theme of like building the language, or why build the language, I think the facilitating things like those unit conversions is an example of a feature that could be built in kind of first class and presented nicely to users.
How are we doing on time, David?
Didn't want to be the one to break the silence.
I was enjoying that silence. There's nothing like looking at lines of code to bring on.
Yeah.
We're doing great. Is there anywhere else you'd like us to go today?
I don't think that's a conversation for today, but at least internally we're just chatting about who do we want to speak to about this and how should we start landing all of this, or at least that's what I obsess about. And yeah, trying to weave together some of that strategy. I think it's going to be initially, like I said, social media platforms or any kind of platforms that are driving community-based sets making or community-based interactions for all kinds of activities. But uh, in a way, driving a more intimate internet. Like I think on the internet, we're great at yelling at each other, or maybe like ordering food from our local restaurants. Like that's about as intimate as you can get on the internet. But I think this will start opening up those avenues for more interactions because reputation is about that sense making. And honestly, I think it lands well initially in more virtualish environments, but I think will gradually spill into offline interactions as well. I think it lands really well in groups of like 500 to 1,000 and more, um, maybe upwards towards, I don't know, a million or more. In the past, like groups that large were just incoherent because a Facebook would just figure wouldn't allow them to would enforce their algorithm on them. But now these kinds of groups can get much more coordinated, and I think you'll start seeing more meaningful conversations on everything from like pandemic response to humor to design and aesthetic and wellness and so on. So yeah, I think what I'm obsessing about right now is how to land this. And so if there's you'll definitely see some conversations which will be clearer to app creators and entrepreneurs. And even if someone out there is listening and is intrigued by this and interested in mashing this with their project, we're happy to chat.
Yeah, I can think of a couple. Just shoot the eye. Or just tell me where I'm off track as I go. But obviously, you go to social media and you're talking about really the ability to carry a conversation across groups and then across channels. But that kind of feels like an end goal. Possibly games is definitely an area where you would like to carry characteristics between games within a particular company and then across an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Because it just seems crazy to start from scratch in every game. But I just wonder whether right now there's a couple of, especially around say non-fungible tokens, because like how to price non-fungible tokens, how to exchange crypto artists, etc. There might be some conversations you could have with people like in an industry that's where there's a lot of energy to design solutions, but there's not really this deep thinking about this layer of the solution. It's just one particular case, but it's been striking like the difficulties with pricing non-fungible tokens is in a way a failure of our ability to understand how reputation works in an emerging world, isn't it? And so we're looking to traditional mechanisms, basically. We're going back into the world to discover there and take whatever value there and bring it into this world as well as our best way of, and I guess that's a way that these patterns just continue to replicate. So something like that might be an idea. There might be a way of creating a conversation in an emerging space that's open to a new pattern, and without engaging or involving you is just going to end up in the same place. So there are a couple of things that jump out. It definitely feels like social media
Mm.
is the place where it's needed, but so often that's the place where,
Yeah.
where there's so many voices already telling everyone what to do. It's hard to.
Yeah. I like that. I think both NFT and gaming that you brought up are really interesting. Gaming in particular, because I think once you start seeing games on Holochain, like that gets so interesting. And they could be really simple games like chess.
Yep.
But something like chess stays limited to pockets because it's not easily, the skill isn't transferable. But now you'll start seeing chess communities grow, and for you to be able to match with people based on skill in a particular context and then transfer those skills into other games, I think that'll be interesting. I think you might also start seeing games which are massive, or you start seeing massive orchestration at scale. Like
Yep.
you could start seeing um, like games which requires like collaboration between 1,000 people to unlock a level. And that to me is just fascinating. Can you like imagine like simulating climate change solving, or like those kinds of games being simulated in these virtual environments? But basically, because you have these collaborative feedback loops, like that kind of collaboration now is possible. So I honestly think, yeah, short term we'll see holochain games as a fun way to land this. Medium term, like whole new kinds of games like that. I can't wait for some of that to
Well, that could
land.
be cool. Hey, Sid, like last year we did a little bit of work on the Holochain, like Space Invaders, and I think it was a Pac-Man
Hmm.
on, and then chess as well. Don't know
Yeah.
that they've been
Yeah.
ported to RSM, but maybe there's some experiments we could run with
Hmm.
those, given that we've got some shells we could evolve. Because kind of the idea was that you could start to bridge things that mattered in one particular game. Like, for example, in Space Invaders, I think we were capturing your hit percentage, for example. So it wasn't
Hmm.
just about level completion. It was like the quality of your play through these particular levels. And then could you
Hmm.
use that if you're demonstrating characteristics in Pac-Man to accelerate the levels in Pac-Man faster? So it's not so much about the high score,
Hmm.
but it's actually about like the frequent challenging of yourself, etc. So
Hmm.
you get the beauty of playing a more complex Pac-Man most of the time instead of starting at the easier levels and moving
Hmm.
to the high score. So the game experience, or the experience across games, ends up building capacity. So rather than
Hmm.
you're fighting for a high score in each individual game, which is kind of great if you love one game, but it gets pretty futile after a while because it's just the same old
Yeah.
pattern replicated in every
Yeah.
environment. Could you use some of the characteristics of your skills and bring them into other environments? So that could
Hmm.
be something that, if that's interesting, like we could definitely set up some experiments and showcase, because
Hmm.
there's existing code and some existing ideas that you guys
Yeah.
could have.
That sounds fun. I think that might be worth, yeah, exploring more, and for people for this to actually land, right?
Yeah.
That would be very cool to watch and to actually play with. Yeah, it's a good suggestion.
Yeah, because you guys are charting, you're charting a path. You're basically, yeah. If it's from a lot of the things we've discussed today, you're charting a path which is operating concurrently to Holochain, and one of these, you're waiting for two things to become realized.
Mm.
The first is uh, a series of a series of experiences for people that where
Mm.
distributed is better,
Yeah. Yep.
and a breakdown in existing communication patterns and tooling in the distributed environment. So they're within this environment, unable to communicate in a way that works. That's like a mainstream experience I could imagine, which then you're providing all
Mm.
of this supportive infrastructure for. There'll be people who
Mm.
bridge into this environment earlier because they've seen the limitations of the current system and all sorts of
Mm.
things, and understood. But ultimately it's about like, oh well, I want to be in this place, but I can't do the things I'm used to doing in this play. How do I solve
Mm.
these problems? And suddenly,
Mm.
you've got all of this tooling for people to grapple with and solve
Mm.
these problems. So yeah, like if I think, I don't know, I'm not a gamer really. So it's just speculating on what could be irritating for a gamer. But if we could take that experiment and find some things that would really matter for people that it's really difficult to do in a centralized environment, and we can solve a few of those problems, then we should be able to make a really nice showcase for what you're doing, as well as have a pretty interesting experience.
Yeah, that sounds cool. And I like the way you broke it up, like people from both kinds, like new things emerging as well as people from the existing who are trying to solve some of the problems that aren't working in the centralized world. And I think that works for like gaming, for social media, for like any kind of meeting people on the internet. Like there will be some cases where distributed is just so much more better. I kind of think of it as the attack and defense strategy. Sorry, Michael, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say I like the gaming example. I think it's like fun and maybe could grab people. One other that I think is nearer to my heart, since I'm not a gamer either, is actually like open source software development, because I think there's similar issues of fragmentation where someone will make a library, and how are you really going to hear about it, and how do you know if it's good? There are a lot of people who are, you know, kind of, you could frame it as like playing a game. I think some developers feel like they make software because it's this kind of game where they're figuring out some domain, and they're
I have a friend who's done a lot of commit crunching to try and get on the GitHub leaderboards, so it's a thing. People do that.
And that like an explicitly gamified thing like GitHub as well, in addition to just the joy of solving stuff. But yeah, I think there's similar issues of kind of coordination and cooperation between, you know, quote unquote players or developers, and issues of trust and whose code is good and discovery, that I think leads to similar maybe fragmentation at scale. So yeah, it's an interesting domain as well, I think.
Good. Well, let's see, reflect on it, but we might have some cool experiments that we can run, and we can come back with a track and track some of those here, or we can come back deeper into some of these deep questions you guys are asking. I think for me, it's pretty fascinating what you're going into, and it would be great to, if you feel like, oh, here's a really rich live discussion, it would be great to just ping me and jump on and do some of that recorded, and again share some of these things you guys are grappling with, because I can see really clearly from what you're describing, it's basically will end up with, it's not just the current paradigm where this issue exists, it will also be the new paradigm, and so you're dealing with both. And yeah, I think that throws some really, really cool conversations.
Yeah, thanks for framing it that way, because I tend to think that we should put out, or I guess like most people want to put out finished product out there, but I think it'll also be fun to just keep documenting this journey as we keep going by just recording our conversations, like you said. And interestingly, that's how Michael came to us, is like through some of the hackalongs that we hosted within the Holochain community. And that's how, I think that's a good approach towards documenting some of this.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Any, Michael or Pospi, anything else from you guys?
I guess I had one last like domain on my mind. My sister's an academic, like a biologist, and she and I had some interesting conversations around peer review and also like tenure as kind of institutionalized reputation practices that have a lot of problems with them. And it seems like something, more flexible, more transparent and inclusive could be really valuable there. Whether or not it makes it into the institutions is another question. But I think for me, I see like open source software and open source knowledge production, I guess, as something that could benefit from some of those same rigorous or semi-rigorous practices, but in a distributed context. So yeah, I think it's an exciting domain as well.
Super. Okay. Well, thanks so much, guys. It was...
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for hosting. Thanks to Pospi for staying up so late. It's past midnight, I guess.
No worries. Time for sleep.
Time for sleep. All right. Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Pospi. Thanks, Sid. And really look forward to continuing this.
Likewise. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, David.